Welcome to wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Thake, and this is the 100th episode of our Minds and Money 5 at 5 show, which is brought to you in association with the Resource Global Network. We started this show back in April 2020. We intended it as a stopgap, weekly 60-minute show, which would bring the industry together whilst we were dealing with lockdown and COVID-19. And say 20 months on, we're now on episode 100. A few admin announcements before we start. To make the session as interactive as possible, please have your video switched on. To ask a question, you have two options. You can go and ask a question in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And if you ask a question there, myself and the guests will do our best to go and come back to you during the course of the show. Or you can also go and use the invite participants function, and I will unmute you, and you can ask your question to the audience live. We'll also be having some polling questions throughout the webinar where you can go and vote. For today's show, we thought we'd bring together some of our past award winners from Minds and Money London, and they are Phillip of Barris, who is former head of sustainability at Golden Star Resources. They were a winner last year of ESG Producer of the Year. Tim Coughlin, Chief Executive Officer of Royal Road Minerals. They were also winner last year of ESG Developer Explorer of the Year. Lucy Crane, a Senior Geologist of Cornish Lithium, who was the winner in 2019 of our Rising Star in Mining, and Ross Allister, who is Director of Mining Investment Banking at Peel Hunt, who has been a previous winner of our Best Broker Awards. So a warm welcome to our guests. I think I'd like to go and kick things off with yourself, Ross. What is your mining outlook for 2022?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm very positive in terms of the outlook for the sector in 2022. I think most commodities are trading at or near multi-year highs, and the supply and demand dynamics in most cases is positive as well. We've seen a period where there's been serial underinvestment in exploration and development of new assets. So in commodities like copper and nickel, battery metals, there's just not the supply to support the move to electrification and the EV revolution. So yeah, outlook's very positive. I think that's specific to the sector. Outlook for the markets is more challenging, and that is interrelated to I guess how mining companies I guess finance themselves. We've just come off I think the worst month in global markets since the start of the pandemic. There's a huge amount of volatility in markets, and that means investors are kind of sitting on the fence to an extent. We've only seen, I think, $2 billion worth of IPOs this year versus 20 billion this time last year. So I think that gives you some indication of the drop off in deal activity. The other interesting dynamic we're seeing as well is the switch from growth to value, which I think, probably leaving on a more positive note, should benefit the sector more broadly as well. There's obviously a lot of tech stocks that are under pressure, and there's a huge amount of value in the mining sector, which I think is inherent and will benefit from capital in due course. Mm-hmm.
One of your clients, Teresa, has signed an MOU with leading renewable energy firms, Total, Aren, and Chariot, for I think some solar photovoltaic projects. How well is the mining industry making the energy transition a reality?
Well, I guess first and foremost, the mining sector is going to play a critical role in supplying the metals that are essential for the energy transition. But it's not just producing those metals. I think the companies also need to demonstrate that the metals can be produced sustainably, and can reduce their carbon footprint while they do it as well. So Teresa is obviously one of the companies that's taking strides in that respect. They're targeting cutting their carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. Pan-African Resources, another one of our clients, is doing a similar solar project at their site, and Atalaya, another one of our clients, is doing one in a 50 million watt solar project in Spain as well. So there's obviously been a lot of discussion of how companies are going to reduce their carbon footprint, but I think you're going to see in the next couple of years that who is actually going to put that into action. There's a lot of promises being made, and institutional investors are going to judge companies by how they actually deliver on those promises. So it would be an interesting couple of years to see how that works out.
You mentioned like a few of your companies that Peel Hunt represents, and they're like listed on the London Stock Exchange or AIM. How do you see LSE AIM growing as a mining finance listing centre over the course of the year?
So we have for about 160 companies that are listed on the London Stock Exchange as a firm. I look after 15 mining companies that are listed in London, and there's a broad split between the main market premium segment, the standard segment, and then AIM as well. I'm sure most people probably know, but London investors typically prefer companies that are more advanced, that are generally cash generative, and ideally dividend paying. I think that the mining sector makes up a far smaller percentage of the market here than it does, for instance, in Australia or Canada. And so it's probably harder for earlier stage projects to get financed here. But that said, there's a far deeper pool of capital in London if you fit the relevant criteria for those investors. So I think it's an incredibly important market for the mining sector. And I think we'll see trends change a little bit as well in the next few years, because I think the proportion of mining relative to the other sectors that are listed in London will increase, and interest in the sector is definitely going to increase as the EV revolution takes a hold and commodity prices kind of continue to increase.
Bringing in our other guest, Lucy from Cornish Lithium. If you had to pick out kind of like one trend that you expect to see in the industry in mining in 2022, what would it be and why?
Sorry,
for
Andrew,
me,
children are,
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want
I think my
to say
Wi-Fi is cutting out. My children are playing Roblox downstairs.
I think the one trend for me this year is really ESG becoming mainstream. And I think the industry's been talking the talk for a while, and some people are doing things really well, especially some of the people on this call. But actually, it seems that it's being built into all decisions now. And you're not going to have a successful project if you're not thinking seriously about the environmental and social impacts of what you're doing. And, you know, coming from the lithium world, the reason that we're looking to extract lithium is because we want it to go into batteries for electric vehicles, because we want to be part of that whole decarbonisation story. That's great, but if the materials that we're producing have a really high impact associated with them, then that kind of negates the reason that we're doing it. And I really think this kind of wider move to ESG not just being a buzzword, but actually being how the mining industry does business is going to be a really positive thing.
Hey, Andrew, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Philipa,
I was just going to come in there after what Lucy said, and I think it's really interesting, Lucy's point. If we look at EY's annual survey of how mining execs have ranked their risks and opportunities for 2022, for the first time ever, environment and social is actually scored as the highest risk. And then in the top four, we've also got decarbonisation, license to operate, and geopolitics, all also elements related to ESG. And then another two out of the remaining six are increasingly linked to ESG performance. So there's one there about access to capital, and the feedback from the mining execs is really about now having to jump through hoops on a ESG perspective in order to get access to capital. And the second element is uncertain demand. And I think that speaks a lot to the points Ross made earlier. So there's no doubt that we really are under this pressure now to demonstrate our relevance to a modern day society, which I think is, you know, both exciting and also challenging for the industry.
Bringing in Tim, I'm just kind of like, you know, interested in like your like perspective when it comes to, you know, like ESG compared with say like 3 to 4 like years ago, when you were having conversations with investors that are looking into investing into Royal Road. How much more prevalent is ESG coming into those conversations that you're having?
Well, I've noticed it particularly, Andrew, over the last 12 months. So I mean, if we back up a little bit, and so, you know, in terms of our ESG has always been part of our business because of the business model that we have. And so, you know, for whatever reason, whether it was wise or not, I guess will remain to be seen. But many years ago, we took on this path of working in areas that were highly prospective yet problematic. So we put the bet on geopolitical risk versus prospectivity risk, and that we could manage that, and that hasn't always worked. But what it did mean is that we had to align ourselves with, well, it wasn't ESG in those days, it was CSR, and various other titles before modern day reincarnation. And so we work very closely with the IFC and the EBRD in post-conflict settings, with the whole idea being that as an explorer, not a miner, finding projects would decentralize some of these centralized post-conflict economies and help some of these conflict-sensitized communities. So we've always sort of done this, and it's quite rewarding now to see the investors coming to us, because in a way, without silly over amplifying a small point, but in a way, we almost had to bury our ESG commitments, under the rug when we were talking to investors. Well, I mean, that's changed completely. We're now, Ross will correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, there's $14 trillion of post Bretton Woods to responsible investment finance, looking for a home. And I think, more than anything, I feel like we're now competing we're competing with the rest of the world in a structural change in respect of how the younger investors, and let's not forget that the demographic of investors has changed from the crusty old, I won't say it, but crusty old people to young people who have a much more of a I don't want to call it ESG. It's just their view on life is different to our investors' views from 20, 30 odd years ago. And so it is now, as Philipa says, it is now a necessity for us to engage, and I welcome it wholeheartedly.
I would add to that, Tim. I think it's driven by, one, it's driven by regulation, and two, it's driven by institutional investors as well. But there's new regulation that's coming in Europe in 2023, which is going to require investors to disclose their sustainability credentials. And they're going to pass on that obligation, obviously, to the corporates that they're invested in. They have to have the corporates demonstrate to them how they comply with rules. So we've seen a marked change in terms of our clients' approach to ESG. Everyone has to produce a sustainability report every year. Most companies will do governance and ESG roadshows with investors, which are not necessarily with the fund managers. It might be with the stewardship teams at the individual institutional investors as well, but that's now commonplace. And they will go into a huge amount of detail in terms of how a company complies or doesn't comply with certain things.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about that to an extent, because I think you can almost apply a template, an assessment template, to the environmental side, and you certainly can on the governance side. There's no doubt about that. But the social side is incredibly particular and incredibly granular, and I don't know how. I mean, for example, given I'm in Bogota right now, and given some of the environments that we have to work in here. And by the way, ESG for us is social license, to be honest, in many of the environments in which we work. Often it's lip service that's paid. It's paid to that by some communities who are actually looking for something else. But my concerns, I just saw that Glass Lewis have come out with a proposal to advise proxy voters on ESG performance of the companies in which they're invested. I'm not, like I say, the E and G, I'm pretty sure they can do. I'm not sure what sort of judgment template you can provide to the social side. And I notice there's also, and we've been looking at this because we're trying to figure out what standards, we were linked to IFC performance standards previously, but to what particular standards we're now supposed to be aligning ourselves with, what's going to become the sort of JORC, if you like, as a simple or 43101 equivalent of ESG performance?
This is actually a really pivotal question now for the mining industry, Tim. You know, with all of the disclosures that we do, with all of the reporting that we do, how do we come up with a common set of metrics that actually allow for a fair comparison? And you know, the hours that are put into this through the peak bodies like ICMM and the World Gold Council to try and find ways that we can compare fairly between sectors, between commodities. And then in the background, we've got the ratings agencies who have now got, you know, a new market opening up to themselves as well. And no surprise that Glass Lewis are popping into this kind of new arena as well. And they're all competing with one another to sell the latest and greatest assessment product. So this is a very, very interesting time for the industry as we try and actually, you know, almost corral all of these things and come up with an agreed set of common metrics measured the same way to actually, you know, make meaningful outcome and understanding from these. Yeah, challenging times. I mean, you know, half of the new recruits for ESG are doing this type of disclosure reporting. You know, this is where businesses actually need new recruits in this field, is to actually assist with this new workload.
Yeah, and that's something that we're finding at Cornish Lithium as well, because, you know, we're very much still at the exploration stage, but we've got a couple of defined projects now that we're starting to move into, you know, getting slightly more developed. And exactly that, which frameworks, which reporting standards, it's such a minefield out there, and trying to find something that's relevant to the stage that we're at and that is going to be a meaningful way to report on what we're doing. There's just a minefield out there. Somebody was mentioning the other day that the United Nations, their new resource management system could be quite a good global one. But like you were saying, Tim, because that projects are so different depending on where they are, it's very hard to have a one size fits all. So,
especially if whoever that is advising Ross's investors.
I think we're kind of like have put the opening poll up on the screen because it leads very nicely into a update from like two of our mining companies. Obviously, like, you know, as we've just been discussing, one of the positive developments in mining has been the growing recognition of the importance of ESG, not just amongst majors and larger institutional investors, but across the entire industry. One initiative I was really pleased that we did in conjunction with Digby and Satala last year at Mines and Money London. We had our ESG awards, and Golden Star Resources won ESG Producer of the Year, and Royal Road Minerals won Best ESG Exploration Developer of the Year. Polling question up on the board that I think all of you decided to answer is, what grade would you give the mining industry for ESG? There are only 5 choices there because our multiple choice only allows 5 choices, so you can't give an F or a G or whatever they do in sort of modern O levels, sort of like these days. Just kind of like looking up in terms of see what the most common sort of like grade is. The audience seems to be veering towards the sort of middle of the road C. I'm just kind of interested. I'll just do a quick sort of round robin, maybe starting with Lucy. What grade would you give the mining industry for ESG, and why?
I would probably give the mining industry a C at the moment. I think there are some companies who are doing much, much better than that, but it's still a whole spectrum. And I think for the last couple of years, exactly as you're saying, ESG is so much more on people's radars now. And it's almost, I think some companies are talking the talk, but not necessarily backing that up by walking the walk. It's almost a bit like greenwashing, but for ESG. And I think there's still quite a long way to go before it's actually integrated into how projects are developed right from the off, right from the first people who are exploring on the ground.
Ross, what grade will you give?
I would agree with the consensus, go for C as well. I completely agree, frankly, with everything that Lucy said. There's some really good examples of companies that are taking the best approach to ESG, but obviously there's, on the other side, there's been some high profile, I guess, negatives for the sector, which tend to gain quite a lot of publicity. And I think that's the biggest challenges for all of us, to be honest, is trying to demonstrate to the general public, Joe Blogs in the street, that the mining sector can be environmentally friendly and is essential for delivering the energy transition, because I think that's not the common perception.
Tim?
I'd give it a C plus, moving up to a B, and the reason I think it's going to move, the reason I think it's going to move to a B is because, you know, we're simple beasts as human beings, and now ESG is becoming less of a promise and more of an obligation. And so, you know, there's nothing like a mining company or an exploration company being forced into being innovative. I mean, that's what I think's missing in terms of the application of ESG principles in our sector is innovation. And that was what would make it a B. But they're going to get forced into it, and so you're going to see things improve significantly.
Just to add as well, like, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years, because most companies have only really just started reporting on certain metrics like carbon emissions, etc. And so actually, if they are reporting and then getting judged on that year on year in their sustainability report, it's going to be very interesting to see what the reaction from the investment community is to that, and to see whether people can deliver on the promises they're making.
Yeah.
Okay. And Philipa, what grade will you be giving?
Yeah, I went for a C as well. I'd say overall we fit a normal distribution curve for the points everybody else has raised. You know, we've got a number of really terrible examples, and there's no doubt there's some really brilliant leading practices out there as well. So it really is a continuum, and I think what we're going to continue to see is that the industry, of course, we all know we're going to be judged by a lowest common denominator. But because we are constantly having new organisations joining the sector, there is that kind of learning period that companies has to go through as well in many respects. And you know, at any point in time, we've got people in different phases of that journey towards sustainability.
Well, thank you very much for that. I see we're already getting a lot of comments in our chat box. I see the comments there from Barry McPeak, and also comments there from Jamie Strauss of Digby. There's also a few questions that I'll go and come back to later on in the show. But just staying with you, Philipa, obviously you were one of the award winners last year. Can you give us a bit of an overview of Golden Star Resources ESG strategy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Digby and Satala for their leadership as well in co-supporting this award with Minds and Money. So look, in overview, the key to our strategic approach to ESG, and perhaps what differentiates Golden Star in some respects, is that ESG is actually woven through the fabric of how we develop our strategy, how we undertake our planning, and then how we also implement within our business. So, you know, from that perspective, you won't be surprised then to hear that we don't really have an ESG strategy per se. What we've got is a vision for the business and the supporting mission statements and our values. And all three of these really speak to ESG, sustainability, corporate responsibility, you know, whatever name you give it, in an integral way. So ESG is effectively a part of the way that we undertake our entire business. And I think really critically, we pick up on two key themes of sustainability, which will be familiar to everybody here. We're really looking at management of risk on one hand, and on the other hand, the creation of lasting value, but through interdependence as an approach. So I want to just share an example which I think will illustrate some of these points and how these things come together. You know, a picture speaking 1,000 words, so to speak. So let's talk about land access. You know, as a mining sector, we all understand that access to land is crucial. You know, without land, we don't have access to our deposits. We can't protect our future prospectivity. We've got, you know, we don't have places to site our infrastructure. We also need to have buffer zones between ourselves and our host communities so that we can protect them from impacts. So doing all of this, we then quite often lock up really large tracts of land. And interestingly, this is actually a great point of conflict on the ground in a social context, quite often with host communities. So how do we justify this? Well, we justify it on the basis, well, we're permitted, and therefore that means we've got the social license. We've resettled project affected people, so we're now entitled to go into that area. And we've paid compensation for the ongoing loss of the use of that land. And that's the typical gold mining, mineral mining, whatever commodity approach to land access. Well, at Golden Star, because of our vision and our mission, we really looked at these things again, and we said, well, if we're genuinely about creating lasting value for our host communities, how can we operate in tandem with these other uses instead of displacing them? What can our legacy of land use actually be? So without going into too much detail, a number of major initiatives cascaded from this approach. And, to speak of one of these, we have a major collaboration with landowners, with host communities, and with agribusiness, where we've used these buffer land around our operations, which hadn't been used for decades because of the rich risk of encroachment or the risk of impact. We converted these, what was once subsistence farms, into high value cash crop production. And we've effectively developed a plantation business doing this work, which is known as GSOP for those who are familiar with Golden Star. And the plantations that GSOP has developed now employ over 1,000 people and support thousands of others. But it's not just the host community that benefits from this. And this is the point that I want to make about interdependence. The company also benefits. When we have this type of employment, it reduces pressure on the mining company for employment within the mines. When people are earning good incomes in agribusiness, it also helps them to avoid being attracted into illegal mining, which is a conflicting land use with our operations. And this productive use of the land also prohibits or avoids encroachment. The fact that local people are working in this area, making good incomes, protects this land in a way that the mining company could never achieve by itself. Mm-hmm. We were then able to extend this thinking to, well, why can't host communities come back onto former mined lands more quickly as well? We took the GSOP concept and we applied that in other areas where we'd finished mining. And I'm proud to be able to tell you that in 2021, we now have oil palm plantations growing in tailings storage facilities to an extent where their yields exceed, if not are the same as, oil palm plantations that are not in tailings storage areas, in natural farm soils. And if that's not a demonstration of multiple and sequential land use, then I really don't know what is. So I hope that example kind of illustrates this integrated sustainability approach.
No, I think it definitely is, and that certainly obviously welcome members from the audience to go and post their questions. I'd just like to go and post you one question that was sent to us by Paul Farrow from Asenco. How will you work with your suppliers and contractors on ESG?
Yes, so Golden Star has again, because of this integrated approach, we have a long history of working towards local procurement. One of the ways that you can create real lasting value for your host communities is looking throughout the whole of the life cycle of your business and saying, well, are there opportunities for host communities to be upstream as well as downstream suppliers or part of the kind of chain for production? So we do a lot of work around local procurement. And of course, what this means, being an international mining company, is we also have to not only help these local companies to develop, but we also have to help them to operate to international standards. And in doing that, we have the opportunity to talk to people about human rights, to talk to people about diversity, to talk to people about business ethics and governance standards. I can really commend to this audience the mining local procurement reporting mechanism as one of these disclosure style tools that really helped Golden Star to go on this journey of how do we judge ourselves in terms of local procurement and how do we know if we're improving. So I think, this is local procurement is a great opportunity for a way that we can have a vehicle for working with local suppliers and vendors.
Bringing in Lucy from Cornish Lithium. Obviously, Cornwall has a really rich mining history, but even having said that, I would imagine there would have been some local opposition to Cornish Lithium's plans. How did you win over local support?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's an ongoing thing. We so far have had really good positive support from the communities that we're doing exploration projects in, but that's not something we're taking for granted, and it's very much a kind of open, ongoing dialogue between us and the communities. You're absolutely right, Cornwall has got this amazing mining heritage, and it's a real source of local pride and people's identity, and I think that makes it a lot easier for us to be working in Cornwall than it would be if these projects were located, if the geology was in another part of the UK, for example. So I think mining is a big part of the local identity, and there are certain parts of Cornwall inland, not near the sea, that don't have the tourist trade, that since the last mines closed in the late 80s have really not had anything that's come in and replaced that. So people are supportive of what we're doing because they think it could be a big source of jobs. We can't forget that there is actually a really significant mining industry still in Cornwall in the China clay industry. Imerys employ nearly 1,000 people still. And so our hard rock lithium project is in the middle of the St Austell area. It's in an old China clay pit. And so people have a pretty good understanding of what mineral extraction looks like there, and see that, the China clay industry is potentially declining locally. But actually, if you can produce lithium from those same rocks, then that's a real opportunity for that industry to grow again. So the way that we've been winning support, I suppose, is by trying to engage as early as possible the communities that we're going to be working in, be open and transparent about what we're doing and our aims for how we want to do it as environmentally responsibly as possible. With our drilling programs, we have the usual concerns about noise, about, we're not doing 24-hour drilling programs, for example, for that very reason. And yeah, I think it's definitely not something that we're ever going to take for granted, but we're very lucky that we've had a lot of local support so far.
Moving on to Tim, you won the ESG Exploration Developer of the Year last year at Mines and Money. Can you give us a bit of an overview as to Royal Road Minerals' ESG strategy?
I shall. I'll thank everybody first for that award. It was very much appreciated, of course. Quite a surprise and a nice one. I just want to go, so I want to, Philipa made a point about, what ESG is and the culture of your business. And so, I have to be honest, and if I go back, given that I've explained what we do and why, and I think what we do is a little bit different to many other companies, and we were modelled and trained by some of the best in the IFC and in the EBRD. But it also does go back to a certain social conscience, I think, that all of us have in our organisation. And I don't know, you don't ask me how that happened, it just happened. So, we have a group of people, all of whom are concerned about their communities and all of whom are concerned about the environment. But there's definitely an aspect of sort of necessity versus design. And so what I mean by that is that if you work in Colombia, and we worked in previous organizations in Kosovo and Bosnia and southeast Turkey with those sort of troubled environment with PKK and the Kurdish communities. And so we've always had this necessity to build social license, because that in fact was our first level of security. And so in the very early days, we were essentially a group of geologists and ex-military guys, essentially adopting standards on military hearts and minds exercises. That's evolved now to various kind of on the ground advanced things we do in terms of social engagement. But probably, and I know what you want to hear about, is the Accelerator, which I'll come to in a second. And the Accelerator is essentially you might want to call it a community venture capital fund. So we essentially seed these truly commercial enterprises, and they have to pass through a fairly serious exercise of being defined, of proving themselves as being, potentially commercial, and then moved on. Now, and the reason we do that, and we're an exploration company, so I need to make that point absolutely clear. We don't ever anticipate building mines. We have partners who have ambitions of doing that. So it's very important for us to leave a legacy. So most of the time we're not going to find anything. That's the basic truth. So we have to, in those places where we don't find anything, it's almost ideal to leave something else behind us and then move on, because what we can do in our next community environment is use what we've done in the previous project as an example of what we'll hopefully be able to do for them. And so that's why the Accelerator, that's how the Accelerator sort of evolved. I'll just share screen if that's okay.
Yeah, it should hopefully come up.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, it's up on the screen, Tim.
Okay, so and I'm going to go through this. I'll go through this very quickly. All of us hate PowerPoint slides, but just to sort of refine the history of this thing. Back in 2017, we signed an agreement in Colombia after the peace process in 2016 between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas. And the FARC had established themselves a cooperative called Coughlin. And they kept talking to us about, we had an agreement with them, a strategic alliance, basically, about productive projects. We couldn't quite figure out what they meant. And then eventually we did. And it's essentially enshrined in the peace agreement that the government would be providing these communities with the sort of projects that actually we're leaving them with. So this is what we do. So as I've mentioned, how the Accelerator works, think of it as a VC fund, community VC fund. We either develop projects in-house, or we do a direct investment through a sort of competition type process where our communities actually present sort of proposals to us. And so we've got currently 3 projects running in Colombia and 2 in Nicaragua. This is the most advanced one, and this is the one that we originally established with the ex-FARC guerrillas. It's actually, we've got the ex-FARC guerrillas growing CBD marijuana, shall I say again? No. We started this in 2018. It's now had about $2.5 million invested in it. It's 50 shareholders, and it's being moved on perfectly. So it's being moved out now into some sort of merger or an IPO. This one is in Colombia, but we're probably going to apply it initially in Nicaragua. We own 25% of this company that was developed by some young students in a university in Colombia, and it's essentially a bioconversion of waste. This one, Bioma, is a reforestation network that we own 20% of, and its goal is really to, well, what it does, and it's doing this for us now. It's actually, we don't know what a carbon footprint is yet until these guys have finished. We'll provide them what they need to finish that calculation, and then it will help us offset that with reforestation programs, basically around Colombia. And the idea is that it, essentially gives SMEs and even individuals, in fact, access to reforestation, the ability to balance their carbon offsets. And this one's really cool. It's one that I like particularly, Quasia Labs. So in Nicaragua, there's a plant that I think it produces the most bitter extract that you can find. And we are working through, so I'm very careful about what I say here because there's some patents pending, but it is very, very useful as a bioinsecticide. And we see that having, if it all works like we want it to, then our communities are going to see a significant change in prosperity and lifestyle. And Amarillo, this is a fun one. So this is a similar sort of process where we're using natural plants that just grow, in Nicaragua. Presumably, when volume increases, would have to crop them. And we've quite nicely produced a hop substitute in beer. So beer is hops are very expensive as a beer component. we can now produce pretty good tasting beer. It was pretty rough at the start, but it's got better now with 90% hops, 90% quassia and 10% hops. And there's our with a very cheesy smile, Executive Director, Sustainability Testing, one of our tonic waters was produced from that plant as well. These are the girls running the whole thing. So Camila's here in Colombia, Tatiana's down up in Nicaragua, and that's some of the things we've taken the liberty of producing a badge for you there, Andrew. Some of the things, the awards that we won last year, and I'm proud to say actually that we've been accepted as a participant in Prince Charles's Terra Carta, which is something definitely worth looking at. I would recommend everybody take a look at that. It's what I like about it is that His Royal Highness has identified industry and commerce as the real powerful and effective mover in sort of rewilding the world. And I think he's right. I think we'll move a lot faster and we'll be way more effective than most governments. And we're also members of E2050 in Colombia, which is Colombia's ambition to become carbon neutral by 2050. So that's a quick run through. I'll stop there.
Excellent. I'm just going to jump in with just one quick question that was sent in earlier from John Zadovich, and just sort of direct it towards your self, Tim. So John's question was, whilst ESG is laudable, should junior mining companies, especially those in the exploration phase, temper their enthusiasm for over-promising and under-delivering on their ESG commitments? In particular, so I was just scrolling down the question here, in particular promises to local communities.
Yeah, yes, big yes. So managing expectations is a big part of our job in any initial community consultation is explaining to communities. I always find this the most interesting sort of concept. Explaining to just to amplify this issue so that I can answer this question properly. One of the problems we have in Colombia is that there's a structural system, a licensing system, where you go from an application to a title, which sometimes can take a long time. You can't drill until you've got a title, and the title essentially evokes the right to build a mine. So when we meet communities, we've generally got a title, or we're going to get a title. And so at that point, their expectations are that we're going to build a mine. We haven't drilled a drill hole. So we have to, and I think, almost every explorer, I think, is pretty well versed in managing expectations of communities, and the sort of thing, making sure they're aware that we're not interested in competing with the small mining operations, which we obviously have to formalize. We're looking for something much, much, much bigger, and that most of the time we won't find it. So, so we spend a lot of time trying, at least, to get that across. It generally doesn't work in the first meeting. It takes a little while for them to understand.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're now going to move on to our second polling question, which I'm hopefully going to launch, and you'll see up on the screen, which leads into our next sort of section. What grade would you, there's a typo here. I was probably late at night when I was writing this, after one glass of wine too many. It should say, what grade would you give the mining industry for diversity? If it was what grade you would give me for my grammar, it would probably be an E. But what grade will you give the mining industry for diversity? Whilst you're voting, let's have a round robin and ask our panelists. Philipa, what grade would you give the mining industry for diversity?
Andrew, I'm afraid that it's a D from me. And, we were chatting earlier that I was visiting mine sites last year in 2021 and still can't find PPE that fits a woman. And, workers fought this fight about PPE almost 3 decades ago, and we've still got operations out there that are making women feel that there's no place for them in the industry. That's just one example. So, sorry, that's my negative score.
No, that's kind of like those sort of like problems and fully understandable. Ross, what grade would you be giving the mining industry?
I would probably even go worse and say E. I mean, the report from Rio Tinto earlier this week was damning, a damning indictment on the sector. I think there's, like with ESG, there's good examples and there's bad examples, but the bad far outweigh the good in terms of diversity. There are positive steps being taken by a lot of companies, but there's more that needs to be done. But it's an ongoing process.
Tim?
Sorry, I'd give it a C. I'm always a bit cautious about this question, because are we talking about gender diversity, or are we talking about cultural and racial diversity? Because I think we're going to score a lot higher on cultural and racial diversity than perhaps most industries. Gender diversity, again, I mean, it depends. You know, I read a S&P report just recently where they highlighted an interesting point. So, you know, geology exploration companies, we employ, and us particularly, we employ kind of three broad streams of people. We employ geologists, we employ, well, actually, because of what we do, a large proportion of our staff are ex-military people, and then we employ environmental and social. And so there's about 20% of US, at least, university graduates in geology are female. And so we would reflect that with our geologists. In fact, we're a bit more than that, about 25%. Environmental and social on our side is about 65% female. We don't have any female ex-military people working for us. And when I just updated the statistics before this meeting, one thing I did notice, which I think we need to improve upon, is that we have a lot of the sort of field-based field assistants that are male, that, you know, that we should. There's no reason why they should be. But I just need to be, you know, so it's like I say. So I would give them a C, because I think I'm taking the broad definition of what diversity is.
Yeah, I mean, I think when
I think
wrote
I
the question, I was thinking.
I mean, I was just going to say that I don't think the diversity in terms of workforce is necessarily reflected in senior management positions or the boardroom across the board. And there's still work to be done, both in terms of ethnicity and in terms of gender, in that respect.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd agree.
Yeah, I think that when I kind of like wrote the question, I was thinking about like diversity and sort of like all its sort of like forms, whether we're talking about diversity of thought or diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, and also leading on to Lucy, diversity of sort of like youth as well, because I think that obviously like youth is very, very important when it comes to sort of promoting diversity inside an organisation. What grade would you give, Lucy?
I'm with Philipa. I think a solid D at the moment. And absolutely, if we look at diversity, is not just gender and race, but you just mentioned it there, Andrew, diversity of thought, diversity of background. I think there's still a really long way to go. And actually, there is, of course, everybody thinks of mining, you think of exploration, it's the geologist out hiking up some mountains with their rock hammer and bashing some rocks. That is, you know, part of the reason that a lot of people want to go into the mining industry, but that is not just all of the jobs. There's such a space now for people who are experts in data science, who either might not have the desire to go somewhere remote and bash rocks, but equally there's a role for data scientists. I think with the younger generation, what we've seen in the UK and Europe, maybe not so much certain parts of Europe, but certainly in the UK and North America, over the last decade, the number of students who are applying to geology or mining related courses has fallen really quite dramatically. And at the same time, you've seen a rise in people applying for environmental sciences and roles where they feel that they can play a part in combating climate change. And it's something I think we touched on briefly earlier, that, you know, a lot of the younger generation today are a lot more environmentally aware and want to have a job that they feel is fulfilling their environmental passions and things like that. And actually, something that the industry has to do is reframe itself. We all know how crucial mining and metals is to be able to deliver this energy transition and combat climate change, but I think we're really bad at telling our story, or at least telling our story outside of our own echo chamber almost. And I also think for diversity, Ross touched on it, senior management at the moment does not reflect, you know, a technical, Cornish Lithium, our technical team, the average age is about 30, I think. We're pretty young. and we've got a good mix of people from different backgrounds. We've still got a long way to go with being properly diverse, but I think we're doing really well. But you're right, across the industry, senior management does not reflect the diversity that you might have lower down. And part of that might be, how do we might have keen people joining the industry, but how do we retain them? And I've just returned to work after 6 months of maternity leave, and I'm very lucky that Cornish Lithium is being very understanding, letting me return to work slightly flexibly where I need to. But actually, as you know, a young mother returning to work, it is a completely different ballgame. And if you're not in a company that's supportive of you having that flexibility, or if your role previously involved you going out to the field a lot and actually you can't do that now, a lot of people find it a lot easier just to slip out of that industry and get another job. So I think there's a huge amount of work that we can do to support people who are coming into the industry and make it a more accessible place for them to stay.
I'm just going to listening to you there, Lucy. I'm not sure this is the right way of asking the question, but what is the average life expectancy of a woman going into the mining industry rather than a man? So I mean, like, is there any difference where like a woman might go in the mining industry and then after 10 years goes and leaves and has a family and like doesn't come back? It's maybe 10 years, but like a man might be in there for like life. They might change from a broker to an investor to a miner. But I don't know, are there any differences there? Is that gap closing?
I don't know the statistics on it. I think that across, it's not just the mining industry. You get to a stage where women might start to have children and might take a few years out of their career, for example, and then find it hard to get back in. And perhaps a job in the mining industry isn't necessarily the easiest for that. But equally, as Philipa said as well, there's also an attrition rate. If you're turning up on, like, I'm in my old job, I turn up to an exploration camp in Ethiopia and there would be 40 people on camp, 2 toilets. I was the only female, and you know, there wasn't anywhere to shower properly because they were just open showers, and it's like, has nobody thought about this? How is this? It, you know, there's definitely an attrition rate. And there's also the phrase that you can't be, it's a lot harder to be what you can't see. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of actually having role models. If you want to encourage a more diverse set of people into an industry, then I think we can be a lot more proactive about creating opportunities for people who might be slightly more diverse than our current senior management. And it's a lot easier to follow a path when you see that someone like you has already trodden it.
It's kind of like having a diversity of youth and bringing more youth in. Is that a way of indirectly addressing the diversity of thought issue? And also, I guess, diversity, gender and ethnicity. I've always think that if you bring more young people into an organization, this is a very broad statement, they're more likely to be open-minded and more likely to be open to sort of change rather than like an old fogey like myself. But I don't know whether that's just like, like an absolutely subjective view, or whether it can be objectively sort of like proved.
Yeah, I don't know whether it can be objectively proved, but I suppose one case study is the exploration team at Cornish Lithium are all pretty young. I think our average age is 30. And that was, I think, a conscious decision by Jeremy, because trying to approach mineral exploration differently, we're looking for lithium contained within geothermal waters, which when we started to do it 5 years ago was a bit out there and a bit wacky. And so actually having people who aren't necessarily biased by previous experience and the way that you have to do things X, Y, and Z is a benefit. Obviously, you've got to balance that with people who have got experience in bringing projects on stream and developing it. But I think it's an interesting thought. And just finally, groups such as Women in Mining and the young mining professionals, I think, are a great thing for the industry, because you meet like-minded people from similar backgrounds, and even if there might not be anybody else like you in your company, then it kind of links you into a community that, you know, it's a great opportunity for networking and just swapping stories.
Yeah, and I certainly encourage viewers like listening and go to the Women in Mining websites. They've got a UK chapter, but chapters all over the world. They tend to do sort of like monthly meetings, either in person or like via Zoom. And the same for young mining professionals. They've got a chapter here in London, but I think they've got about 12 chapters all over the world.
Yeah, we've got a lot now.
Probably, yeah, probably so, like even more. Just bringing back Ross into the conversation, there was something that you were talking earlier, right at the start of the program, about investors. I'm just wondering is whether there's any anecdotal or objective sort of like statistics as to what is the average age of a mining investor, and has it changed over the last number of years? Do you have any sort of anecdotal or objective evidence at Peel Hunt's?
That'd be an interesting analysis to undertake. I don't
For your
off the
next
top of my
survey.
head, but there's, I mean, I think there will naturally be an injection of youth in the next few years, because there's a lot of fund managers who are slightly older who have retired or are taking the opportunity to move away from the sector in the last 10 years because we've been through some harder times. And I think as commodity prices continue at the levels that they're at or higher, there's going to be more institutional interest in the sector. So a new generation of investors will take to the sector. So I think we'll see some of that coming through. And I would agree in terms of what you were saying, Andrew, in terms of, I think, a younger generation, but probably more innovative and open to the kind of new ideas on how to do things. So it's certainly something that should be welcomed. My biggest exposure to the benefits of diversity are at the boardroom, because the governance rules effectively kind of require companies to have diversity of skill sets in order to kind of challenge the executive and hold them to account. But that shouldn't just be the skill sets, that should be the background, that should be the ethnicity, that should be the gender and everything else. But most companies are making good efforts to try and diversify their boards, but there's definitely more work to be done there. I'd probably include Peel Hunt in that. We're hopefully getting our third non-executive, a female non-executive, onto our board in the next month or so.
And just kind of like a last question for the panelists. If there was one thing, just one thing, the mining industry could do better to go and promote diversity, what could it be? I'll start off with yourself first, Philipa.
Okay, for promoting diversity, and I like Tim's point about looking at diversity beyond gender and looking more at inclusion. So really the creation of workplace cultures where people feel that they can belong and they can contribute. I think the thing we need to do differently is to also look a little bit outside of our organisations. So, let me give you an example. It's all very well talking about having diversity within the business, but if we've got community consultative committees that are dominated by one gender or are dominated by people of a certain ethnicity or a certain age or a certain socioeconomic status, then it really undermines the credibility of this whole conversation we're having around diversity and inclusion. So I think there's an opportunity for us to go beyond, that inward facing view again, and to Lucy's point, to start to look a little bit outwards as well, and to how can we create leadership within the circle of influence that we have as well.
Tim?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this point about young people, because that's it's key for us if we want to relate, and I'm going to make it more sort of practical and obligatory. If we want to relate to Ross's young investors, then we need young people in our sector. But there's a problem, and I'm not sure. I mean, maybe in Cornwall it's different, but there's a big problem. So for the last 7 or 8 years, we've had a dearth of new graduates coming through the industry. That's certainly the case. And in fact, I'm actually just trying to put a young guy on a master's course, a Colombian guy. It's been really difficult to find any enthusiastic universities. A lot of universities in Australia have either moved away from earth science or turned their earth science departments into environmental departments. And so there's a real dearth of young people in the sector. So at some point, I don't know how I remember when I was a young geologist, there was a really strong relationship between industry, and this was in Australia, industry and research, and promulgated by institutions such as AMIRA and these type of things. I think in terms of promoting diversity, we need more young people in the industry, but we need to, rather than just, we need to make some serious sort of structural, strategic changes to ensure that kids want to go and do geology or mining engineering or something like that.
Because
I think,
like,
sorry, I was just going to say, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Tim. If we want young, diverse people to see mining as actually an industry where they can have a great career and make a positive impact on the planet, then we need to start telling our story a bit better. And we need to kind of reframe that whole conversation about, you know, mining, oil and gas, bad, environment, good. You know, we are part, you cannot combat climate change and deliver this energy transition without a hell of a lot of raw materials. So I think the biggest thing for me would be exactly that, reframing the narrative so that people see the extractives industry as actually a place where you can have a really positive and meaningful impact on that. And then I think we'll attract people from interesting backgrounds, and hopefully big changes need to be made so we don't have more reports like Rio's coming out, but we can keep them to stick around.
Yeah, and I say I've got like no idea if it's sort of changed over the last sort of like 30 or so years. But I know when I was at university, the university I went to was 51% female and 49% male. But I know within arts, there was definitely a heavy bias towards sort of like females versus like males doing arts and doing modern history and doing English literature. But I remember the geology faculty, it was barely 25% were actually female. I've got no idea whether that's changed over the last sort of like 25, 30 years since I like graduated, but I hope it has.
It's the same, Andrew. There's an S&P report just came out recently. It's the same. It's about 20 odd percent.
Gosh.
Yeah.
But now the classes have shrunk. Right? So when you were going through this problem, probably about 40 or 50 undergraduate geology students. Now there's about 10 in average in these universities.
And I'll give the last word to Ross. Ross, what's the one thing the mining industry can do better to promote diversity?
I think it's probably been covered off by the points that have already been made. I mean, I think female CEOs would help. It's a similar type of point as saying that you should have younger people in charge of businesses. Anglo Pacific, one of our clients, just appointed Mark Bishop Lafleche, who's a young CIO already within their team, to be the CEO, and that's gone down well with the market. So I agree with the points that have already been made. But yeah, I mean, I think I saw a question from Jimmy Strauss coming through there, that we need to change the perception. But I think the big challenge is, how do we actually do that? Because it's you can come on these things, and I think everybody at conferences will talk about all of the things that we know already, that mining is essential to the energy transition, etc. But the public perception isn't the same, and mining is still seen as a pejorative word. So I think we just need to keep on banging the drum, to be honest. Maybe think about a rebrand, call it something else.
And bang the drum in a different way, Ross, because I think we're still even using modes of media that young people don't use. I mean, you know, put your hand up if you've got a Facebook account. The young people don't have Facebook accounts anymore.
TikTok now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've got to actually, I mean, and I think this will be really interesting to see where Lucy and her young team goes as well, in terms of selling the message in a way that's relevant to a different audience. You know, we're not the right group in many respects, looking at who's on, you know, who I can see right now. We're not necessarily the right group to answer the question.
Well, I look forward to seeing Cornish Lithium's TikTok account if and when it's being launched, although Lucy's going to tell me that you already go and have one. I think on that note, it brings us actually to just over the hour. So we didn't have time to get around to everyone's questions and everyone's comments, but thank you to everyone who sort of wrote in and everyone who contributed. Thank you to our guests, who are Philip of Barris, former head of sustainability at Golden Star Resources, Tim Coughlin, Chief Executive Officer of Royal Road Minerals, Lucy Crane, Senior Geologist at Cornish Lithium, and Ross Allister, Director Mining Investment Banker at Peel Hunt. I hope you had an enjoyable time. Also, thanks to our media partner, Resources Global Network. See you next time. Oh, one thing before you go. There are some drinks this evening at 16 Newburgh Street, Whitehorse, Soho. So if you're in London and you're in the mining industry, please go there afterwards. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.